This is a Viva PR podcast.
To have a really good morale and a successful team, they have to understand what they're contributing. Once they've bought into the why and they see how they fit in, they just give you so much more. Sleepers for the week. You can't afford to spend 10 hours to decide how you're responding to a political outcome. You have to be able to be like, okay, this is the situation. I already understand all this concept, and so this is my advice.
Hello and welcome to PR in the Real World, a public relations podcast from Lancashire's leading agency Viva PR. I'm your host, Tony Garner, and I've been running a successful PR agency here in the northwest of England for 22 years. PR in the Real World offers a unique perspective on public relations seen through the lens of an independent award-winning regional agency. And with that, it's definitely more Lancashire than London. At Viva, we're all about impact. We live, work and play alongside our clients, and we see firsthand the difference our work makes in the communities we serve. So this podcast dives into the experiences of PR pros from our world, and we'll explore how to achieve real-world results without the need for massive budgets or celebrity endorsements from Hollywood A-listers. On today's episode, I'll be joined by Shira Bamber, a director at the communications and strategy consultancy Alma. Throughout her career, Shira has developed a reputation as a fixer, becoming the go-to person for any challenging problems. Having previously served as Head of Policy and External Relations at Preston City Council, her current role blends policy, strategic comms and stakeholder management, using the vast experience gathered through her career to benefit clients, including acting as Head of Communications at National Infrastructure Group Network Plus. Like us at Viva, Shira emphasises a holistic problem-solving approach to comms. So let's talk straight away about that CV of yours. It's quite an interesting one.
I've had the privilege of having a really interesting career so far, hopefully long to continue. So I started out long ago that I don't want to talk about, but working as a youth worker in a homeless and young people charity. And it quickly became obvious that while I was very passionate about the work, wasn't a very good youth worker. And what started to happen is people were like, do you know anything about reports? Do you know anything about social media? Do you know anything about, fill in the blank? And it quickly became apparent that I could do what I was actually much more naturally able to do for something I really was passionate about. And while working for them, which I think in the end was about 8 to 10 years in total, I started to do a master's in strategic communication so I could work with them, learn everything, and continue to upskill. It was a really, really great opportunity. I loved it. But obviously that everything comes to an end, and it came to a point where I needed a bit more work because I was part-time, I had small children, and I started to work for the council, Preston City Council. There I had, 3 or 4 different roles over the years, and I got involved in everything from, you start out with dealing with bins and council tax, and you end up with like arts festivals and economic policies. And then going from there, I was headhunted and moved over to Network Plus, which again, completely different experience, which is what I wanted. I wanted to see a different side of things, and I had the opportunity to look at a national business, 86 different locations, so geographically disparate workforce, really big clients, and again, be able to take the same skill set and apply it there. It's been great.
Excellent. And now you're part of Alma. I noticed you've just celebrated your first birthday. And so tell us a little bit about what Alma is and what Alma does, what services you provide.
Okay, so Alma came about a year ago, and basically my 2 business partners and I started talking about what we actually wanted to do. We were all leaving roles that we were ready to leave, and the interesting thing about us is obviously I'm strategic communications, very much public sector is my background. They're both journalists. Ed was the director of audience for Reach PLC, national big company. By combining, we kind of are both sides of the fence, and it gives us a really interesting opportunity to work with clients. And so some clients we work on independently, sometimes we work together, and we offer a range from, they work on a lot of editorial, newsroom, media stuff. I do strategic communications, media training, problem solving. It really depends on what the client needs.
You described your approach when we chatted before this pod as creative problem solving. How do you kind of articulate that? What does that look like?
Basically, the way I approach communications is what's keeping them up at night? What are the things that you know, the chief exec, the directors, the politicians, whoever it is, what is it that is their real problem that they're trying to overcome? What is their real ambition that they're trying to achieve? And comms is really well positioned because we get a bit of a helicopter view. We get to see the whole organisation, and I use that to my advantage. So, you know, if a client comes to me and says, we need a video, I'm probably not your person. If it's we want to achieve this, or we can't get over this, then I can help because I'll start looking at the big picture. Okay, what's working? What isn't working? What are the opportunities you haven't opened the door to? And how can we collaborate either internally or with partners? And that's the approach I always take.
It's interesting that we need a video thing. I've talked to lots of heads of comms within local authorities and health trusts and so on, and often they get that knock on the door from teams and groups asking for, we need that poster, we need that video, we need X, Y, and Z, and they've come up with the creative solution almost before that you've got to the question of what problem are you trying to solve. So. Yeah. How difficult are those conversations? Because in some states, I heard the expression "everyone's a comms expert." How do you need a diplomat's hat on as well, do you?
You do, and I think being in comms is very much like working with politicians, absolutely, and I've had the joy of doing both. And I think for me, what was interesting, so when I joined Preston City Council, the comms team had a really bad reputation internally. It was treated very much as we have to deal with comms, leave it till the end of the project, absolutely tell them we need a logo for this, or we need, the press release or whatever it was. And so it did take some very intentional time where I would go and meet with different directors and different heads of services and spend that time of, what is your problem? What are you trying to do? What are your objectives that are really problematic? And in any organisation, it's usually we need to save money. And so actually, how can we help you do that? And how can we, help, whether that's working better with partners, whether that's getting a certain message out and all of those things. And some of it takes time because it's the proof is in the pudding of actually, okay, we solved that little headache. Let's work on the bigger one, and let's, and become tried and tested and proven that, I'm there, I understand what they're trying to do, and we can work through it together.
Because the danger of not having that kind of conversation at the outset is that you just end up sending out stuff.
And you don't achieve anything, and you remain operational only. And to be a strategic service, you absolutely have to be plugged in to the bigger conversation and really understand those problems. And I think heads of comms who don't succeed are the ones who are like, that's not my problem. Whereas my policy has always been, everything is my problem. How do we get through it?
And it must be frustrating for the teams working under those heads of comms where they're on that hamster wheel of just producing the next thing, reacting to the next request, and
the next person who knocks on that door.
And not understanding what the kind of strategic priorities might be and the problems that they're actually solving. That they're just doing a to-do list. Tick, tick.
Yeah, I've always found with my teams, once they've bought into the why and they see how they fit in, they just give you so much more and you get a much better result. You've got much happier staff, and then you've got happier clients, whether those are your colleagues or your clients. We
work with a lot of local authorities here in the northwest of England. Most of the council comms teams are very small. They don't have a cast of thousands, and they don't have huge budgets either. Presumably that was your experience too. How do you get the most out of people and budgets then?
Oh, what a hard work. I think, like I said, in terms of the people, it's feeding into them. So them understanding giving them a sense of purpose. Why are we doing this? Why does this matter? I've always been big on collaboration, so the feedback loop is very important, making sure they can feedback to me. So if I put something out, I used to be like, what do you think of this? I've just written it. And I'd take their feedback on board because I felt it was very important for everyone to feel like they could fix and help and improve. Comms is inherently collaborative. And it's also about thanking them for the thankless tasks. The one thing my team always noted is every other team would get thanked in, say, the newsletters or whatever, but the comms team didn't because we wrote it. And so I would make sure, whether it was just things like bringing chocolate in on a Monday or recognising...
You're a great boss.
Whatever it was, just recognising the hours, the effort, the consideration, and being upfront when things don't work, and obviously trying to protect them from some of it as well.
Now, you've been on both sides of the fence, as it were, internal and in agency now. What... You'll have seen relationships when they work well and when they don't work so well. So can you give me an example of where do things go wrong, do you think, when agencies are working with public sector internal teams? And
I think the biggest problem is communication. Obviously, I would say that. But, I think with the in-house teams, they're often not upfront about what they're really trying to deal with. It's similar to when people come to them and say, I need X. They'll sometimes say, I need X, a video, whatever it is. And they won't necessarily give you actually the context. They won't necessarily tell you the realistic time frame they're dealing with or where the kind of issues might be coming up. And I think that honest and upfront conversation saves everybody a lot of trouble. I used to struggle with agencies because they didn't understand just how reactive a council is and has to be, and how, the politicians aren't going to wait till next Tuesday. You do need to be able to respond, and how do you make that happen? And it would have been a lot smoother if I'd known enough to tell them, these are going to be our pressure points, this is what I need, and for them to be honest and say, we won't be able to do that. Yeah. Because, I do have a team. When I was in-house, I did have a team. I could fill in the gaps, but it was really annoying when I filled in the gaps when I didn't know I was going to have to. Because then it felt like, well, why am I paying you X amount of money when I'm now saving you? And I have to pretend to my, higher-ups that I didn't just do all that work. And so it is about that honest dialogue and being really clear about expectations.
You mentioned politicians there as well, and that's a whole interesting universe. How do you cope with their demands and understanding the pressures and delivering for them, but also kind of being able to walk out with your head held high?
It's an art and a dance. I think it's all about, again, having conversations, understanding what are their pressure points, what's keeping them up at night, what are their real things that they're ready to die in a ditch over. Because there are some arguments that are not worth having. There are times where, it would have been better if we'd done X or Y, but I knew that fight, I wasn't going to win it. And we were going to lose a lot of time. There are other times where I'll push really hard because you can see, actually, if I give you this compromise, because really, you say that this is what we're trying to do, and this video, for example, is extremely important, but really, you're trying to get this across to your constituents. Well, I can help you get that across just by this, because this is what they'll hear. And it's about that. If I understand what they want, then I can help them meet that. I just might not deliver it the way they asked for.
Yeah, that sounds like you've had quite a few tricky conversations then down the years with different individuals. I guess it depends on how much they listen to you as well.
Yes, depends on how much they respect your opinion. I've worked with some politicians where at the beginning of our relationship, they did not want to know because I represented something comms can be a dirty little secret for some politicians. And they were convinced, they had a lot of prejudice against me in terms of they thought I wanted to change them. They thought that I didn't understand. Maybe they thought I didn't support the political ambitions, whatever the case may be. And it did take time to let those conversations happen more so that it was less fractious, and some of that was, again, about finding those areas of compromise, understanding where I could personally flex a bit and where things, there are codes of conduct and things that you have to follow. So understanding where those hard lines are as well. And similar to working with colleagues or clients, it's demonstrating my value time and time again, and then that relationship changes. If I say I'm going to do this, I have to do it. Yeah. And if I haven't done it for whatever reason, I need to be able to explain that. And it's about humanising the whole process and moving away from comms will sort that, or, that's a comms problem, that's a politician's problem too. This isn't our problem. What can we do together to fix this?
Do you see any kind of like parallels between the politicians on one side and then the kind of board directors in the private sector world?
Yes, I would say that there are a lot of politicians who aren't in politics. And I think in big companies, you can have boards, you can have directors, you can have chief execs who act like dictators, who it doesn't matter what strategy they've signed off on. If they want that Instagram channel to be started tomorrow, it's happening. I found that my experience navigating political nuance was extremely helpful in the private sector, because then I could understand egos make the world go round, and how do we make that work for what we're trying to achieve, and again, where can the compromises be made?
Sounds like you got a master's in psychology alongside the communications. I mean, there is a lot of kind of human behaviour, and like you say, one of my first bosses used to have an expression where he used to say, "PR, it's all about egos and politics." Tony, and that little expression kind of floats around in my head quite a lot sometimes. It sounds like that's been quite a lot of your experience too over the last 20 years.
100%. I think relationship management is probably 80% of my job, and has always been. You have to understand the people, you have to understand how they interact with each other as well, because, again, dealing with politicians or boards, sometimes if it seems like Mr. Jones is getting his way, then
Mr. Smith isn't happy.
Yes, exactly. Just because it's Mr. Jones, and it doesn't matter that he agrees with what you're doing. So, you have to navigate that. And I've always said I would rather more information. I'd rather drown in information than be walking into something blindfolded without the information I need. And so I've always said, whether it's a colleague or a client, tell me everything, including the things that you really don't want me to know about and the things that can never go anywhere. Let me know all of that, because otherwise I can't do my job properly.
This world and this world experience that you've got, it must be a real eye-opener to the journalists that you work alongside. I mean, here at Viva, we employ, my background is in journalism, we employ lots of ex-journalists, but that transition into PR sometimes is quite a tricky one for them, because they've not been exposed to that. They just see a cracking story and move on and deliver it. But very often haven't done that stakeholder management piece in the past, and it is quite a baptism sometimes.
100%. We've had some very interesting conversations, and there've been some, even some contracts that I'm not heavily involved in, where suddenly one of them will turn to me and be like, "Can I just ask how you see this?" And then I'll say, "Oh, well, if I was doing that, this is what I'd do." And they'll be like, "Huh, okay." And it means that, they're working with a lot of different, publisher type clients, that suddenly they're like, "Oh, well, yes, journalists approach it like this, but actually if we just tilt, just to the side, we could be so much more effective." And they do, we don't always agree on some of those things. And there are times where there has to be a bit of a war between us because of their clients and mine. But it's really interesting. Similarly, they sometimes give me insight and I'm like, oh, yeah, I never would have thought of it like that. So it's really valuable.
Yeah. Because they can give you that kind of media perspective and the rationale and what a journalist might be looking for. 100%.
Yeah,
really interesting. There must be some interesting conversations.
For sure.
So how do you balance in a perfect world? You can plan a lot of the comms, and you've got strategic comms objectives and goals that you're chasing, but you're in a reactive world. How do you balance that, Shira?
I mean, sleep is for the weak. But, I think, again, it's being... I'm not a hyper organised person personally, but in work I have to be. I have to understand, you have a lot of plates spinning. You have to, and it is that thing, because if something is suddenly on fire, whether literally or metaphorically, you're going to have to deal with it. And what about this long-term plan? And so I find you just have to be really honest. You have to, with the people that you work with, whether again that's in-house or clients, and kind of be upfront about, then this is where knowing where your pressure points are and where your real objectives are, because sometimes you have to let something slide to let that be dealt with, and then you can switch it back once it's resolved. And you have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to respond. You can't afford to spend 10 hours to decide how you're responding to a political outcome. You have to be able to be like, okay, this is the situation. I already understand all these concepts, and so this is my advice.
Without going into kind of any, lifting any secrets or anything, are there any kind of crisis situations that you can recall, or difficulties that you can talk about where you've done that, where you've been spinning plates?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what the actual context was, but I have this very vivid memory of going into work, and for some reason I was going on the bus that day. I was going into work, and I think I'd been on the phone since 6 a.m. And with, the deputy leader and the chief exec and, and things like that. And I remember sitting on the bus on my phone, having the conversation, quickly putting something into writing and getting it to the journalist before the next stop or something. And then being back on the phone to the deputy leader, and he was like, "How have you just done that?" And I was like, well, you have to. And then I was like, okay, by the time I'm in the office, we now know that I can have that conversation with the journalist. They have something in writing. We can then deal with this, and there's no problem. But it takes a lot of confidence. You have to know that, you have to know your opinion. You have to understand the context and be willing to kind of just move forward.
And I guess you have to have the trust of those higher ups as well, that to bring you into the room. So some of the frustrations must be when you hear about things too late, when actually half the building's known for several weeks that something's been brewing. Yes,
that is the single most frustrating thing about being a head of comms. And I was very lucky that by the end, I was, the second person who was told in the building about almost anything. Yeah. But there were many times that I wasn't. And the number of times you would be the one picking up, saving the baby, picking up the pieces. And so this is where my whole problem-solving approach to comms came from, and this is how I sold my team on it, is if we don't say yeah, if we're a computer says no branch, then we're never going to get any better. But if we are always, if they come to us and we might say, well, we can't do what you've asked for, but we can do this, then we're going to become that trusted advisor, which means we're going to start getting that information quicker. And then we won't, it'll be 10 times harder to fix it than if we could just have that conversation first. But it's a process, and you have to get everybody on board, and you have to, manage those relationships. Yeah.
In your most recent role at Network Plus, how is that different? And as an interim kind of lead, does that give you more freedom? Or did you know it was always going to be an interim fixed post and so on?
I knew it wasn't going to be a forever thing. I am a very purpose-driven person, and I didn't see it being, something that would be the rest of my life. I think it was very interesting because the remit was go in, clean house, make changes. They need a professional communication service. They need these things. Their clients are asking for and so that's what drew me is, don't hire me if you want, carbon copy of what you've had before. But if I can make change and I can, do things differently, I'm on board. And so that was an exciting thing. Yes, when you first go into an organisation, suddenly, that transition from being the organisational expert to the newbie, and suddenly going from talking about national planning policy to regulations around digging up roads, there was a steep learning curve. And I spent a lot of time, on sites in random places across the UK because I had to understand what they were doing before I could.
Lots of high vis and hard hats.
Yeah. And it's a very male-dominated industry, so they, would look and I'd just be tottering up to the site without any idea what they were doing, and they'd have to explain. So it was a very interesting transition. But yeah, it lends itself to a different thing, and where the public sector, nothing you do is ever enough. You have to accept that. There is always more that you can do, and there's always more that you won't be able to do because of budgets, politics, team size, whatever it is. The private sector is different because they don't want, and for a company like that, obviously the bottom line really matters. But also you just do things differently, and they're not going to do things. In the council, it's very easy to convince you to do something because it's the right thing to do. Whereas with the, board of directors, it's more, this is the right thing to do because of this, and this is how it will help your business. And it's a different conversation, but an interesting one.
And so what were you able to do there that you weren't, say, in the public sector, or what were you able to bring from your public sector experience leading teams into that role?
I think I was able to bring a mindset of, I knew how to get things done. I knew how to navigate sensitivities, and I knew that was going to be part of that role. They had something like, was it 23 directors? So, there was a lot. It's a big sprawling business, and you have to navigate a lot of things, and similar to political portfolios, which you have to balance how much attention they're getting, there it was, how much attention is water getting, telecoms, all of those things. So I could bring a lot of that background to it. But then it's, new sets of clients, different pressures, different priorities. And just learning how to, suddenly I didn't have to worry about risk assessments and risk registers, and that was a beautiful thing. But equally, you have to, justify your experience in a different way. Interesting.
And what have you learned from that experience, do you think? What do you take away? Because you've no doubt left a legacy within that team, but what do you think you've taken away that you can bring into your next projects?
I think working on that geographically disparate workforce was fascinating. The role had a much stronger focus on internal communications than I'd ever had before. At the council, you're pulled in so many ways, whereas here I could be very specific, and internal communication was a massive priority.
How big an organisation was it?
So it was, I think the workforce was around 5,000, but because they're in 86 locations, including Wales, it was very difficult because, a percentage of it, maybe 30, 40, probably 30% were in offices, and the rest were on the street. And so how do you communicate with them, and what do they want to know? But you still have an IT team of 30 people. So how do you send something out that relates to both of them, or if it's not going to, and there's such stringent regulations and safety concerns, and how do you get those across to people who, get up, go to a site, go home?
A mouse mat and a poster isn't going to fix that.
It really isn't, and there's, a traditional intranet's probably not your answer either. No. So, that was a fascinating project to work.
So I'm intrigued. How do you solve that disparate workforce that isn't always connected like we are? Because it's normally a kind of a go-to, isn't it, for a team like ours? We're sat behind our computers all day long, and you kind of have that worldview that everybody's like that.
The key is understanding that there's not a single bullet. If you look at the American election and the way the politicians were, canvassing and doing things pre-election, that's a good example, because they don't have a single audience. They can't just think, well, if I sort Twitter, then I'm sorted, or if I, go on TV, one debate and it's fixed. It's the same thing with internal comms for that kind of organisation, because what works for a third won't work for the others, and you can't expect one type of thing to be the fix. And so you do that combination of, okay, we'll have an intranet, but we'll have it that fits through their mobiles, and they actually have to, there's something they have to do through it, which means they'll open it. Yeah. And we'll also have posters so that when they're picking up, the road barriers, they're passing a poster that's about safety. And then we'll have, a physical magazine that comes out every once in a while that when they're on the lunch break, they can read that. And we'll, and it's that combination of, and also we'll make sure our social media has some of the key messages to them because they're looking at it too.
Yeah.
And so it's that, okay, actually, if I look at the whole picture, if it all connects and it's getting my message across, but a single one won't do it.
Yeah, so connecting all the different dots. Yeah. That's another kind of theme that we talked about before, how you connect the different dots. Yeah. And I could see your eyes lighting up there, just describing the challenge. So that it must be satisfying when you get decent results from the work you've done like that.
Yeah, it is, and it takes time. You have to trust the process. You have to trust your experience. And you also have to be willing to change your mind. And that's one thing I've always kind of been able to do, is you have to be able to pivot and be like, well, we tried it this way. It didn't actually work like that. So how do we pivot and make that more effective? And some of that is about, actually, should we listen to those people at site? And that's why I spent so much time in my high vis on site, because it was a bit of, how would you like, would a podcast work while you're driving to sites? And would what would help you? How can we do that? Is it a sticker on your barrier so that every time you look at it you think, oh, I've got to put those goggles on? Yeah. Whatever it is.
Yeah, so you're not just in your kind of ivory tower dreaming up these tremendous creative solutions that actually land like really flatly in the real world.
Because I'm not the target market, and that's the key thing to recognise is, yes, a podcast, an intranet, and a quick text would be perfect for me, but I'm not the people I'm speaking to. And how do we reach them? That's
really interesting. So when you are faced with tricky situations, have you any kind of golden rules that you fall back on that we can? I mean, this podcast is all about sharing insight and picking people's brains, and so that our listeners can go, I'll do that.
Yeah, I guess my first one is always ask questions. I always go in with, and anyone who's ever worked with me will tell you this, I always go in with a very long list of questions, because I don't know what I don't know. And it's, and I will ask things that people think are unrelated, because I want to see the biggest part of the picture. And so I always, ask a lot of questions, because if I start with talking, then it's probably not going to be that useful.
And I guess on that, it's about not being afraid to ask the on the surface dumb questions as well.
Yeah.
And not going in with any ego yourself. Yeah. We're definitely like that, because we're drawn into so many different disparate worlds. Mm-hmm. There's no way we can understand the detail of.
No, I find when you ask, even if you ask the question that you think you know the answer to, and you've already asked somebody else, getting those responses in their own words and their own frame of context can be massively valuable. So sometimes I will go to every board member or every director or whoever it is and ask them the same thing. And from the suite of answers, I have my answer. But from one person, I might have just gotten, their bias and their fixation.
And sometimes you can draw nuggets that, when you replay that back to people, that they're not even aware of themselves.
100%. And then they're like, because, you do that and you say, oh, well, so-and-so said this, and I'd be really curious to see what your response to that is. And they'll go, oh, do you know, I never actually thought of that, because from my perspective, using the counts, one person's focused on environment and the other person's focused on tech. Actually, people never really think about tech and environment, but one of the conversations I had with Lucy recently was, actually the tech industry, when you're talking about AI and cloud data and data centers, they're using more carbon than the aviation industry. And so we need to start talking about our tech services when we're talking about our environment and sustainability. And at the moment, those conversations aren't being had.
Any other kind of golden rules, but apart from, clearly asking the right questions and listening are right up there. Anything else?
I would say the other two are do your homework and be confident. I think you always do your homework, so it's not just asking the questions, but it's looking around, it's understanding. And then it's when you're going to give that advice, when you're going to step into the lurch, you have to do it confidently, because even if you're right, if you go in and you're not coming in with the gravitas and the confidence, they're not going to take you up on it, or they're not going to trust it, and then it might not work the same way. Whereas if you can walk in and you say with 100% conviction, this is how we respond to that, then you'll keep being asked back. But I've seen, like my deputies in the past who have come up with great plans. I'm 100%, their ability, I know they can do it. And they walk into that room and they give an insecure giggle, or they, their body language screams, I don't know what I'm doing. And I watch them be disregarded and undermined, and that's really, and generally, obviously, I'll step in and try and sort that. But in some instances, you watch it and you just think, if you had have just delivered that the way you told me that, this would have worked.
Interesting. Now, Shira, we came across each other on LinkedIn initially, like a lot of people do, and most recently on LinkedIn, you've been trying to pull together. You're passionate about this industry and comms in general, and you've been trying to pull together a group of like-minded people to kind of meet up. Tell us a little bit more about that. We'll give you your little group of
Amazing. So yeah, it's I'm starting a comms network for people who are in senior roles, to just have a safe place, a bit of therapy really, but also some hive minding, because I've found in the past, I've been in some of those groups, perhaps, just for local government or for different, specific roles, and they're so valuable. But at the moment, when I go into networking, too often we're pitted against each other. There's always an agenda. Someone's trying to sell to you, all of those things. And so when I set this up, I thought maybe 5 people would come. I didn't really know. But I basically put a call out and realised, I know a lot of people in these roles across the county. Why don't we work with each other a little bit? Why don't we give that space where, 5 people in the room might all be dealing with the same type of issue, and 3 others might have already done that. And so let's have that conversation and see.
So this is for Lancashire comms professionals. So how can people get involved?
I'm the only Shira Bamber on LinkedIn, so I'm easy to find. But basically, so we've got another event coming up in January. Just need to confirm the location. But yeah, if you follow me on LinkedIn or find Lancs Comms on LinkedIn, and you'll find, an Eventbrite for it.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, we'll wrap things up. But once again, thank you so much for sharing all those insights, and best of luck with the network. Thank you, Shira.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real-world stories from the PR frontlines.